President Biden spoke a short while ago with Prime Minister Netanyahu. The leaders discussed the situation in Gaza. The president emphasized that the strikes on humanitarian workers and the overall humanitarian situation are unacceptable. He made clear the need for Israel to announce a series of specific, concrete, and measurable steps to address civilian harm, humanitarian suffering, and the safety of aid workers.
That was Secretary of State Anthony Blinken on Joe Biden's call with Benjamin Netanyahu today. And that takes me to today's threat assessment. The U.S. government meddling in other countries. Now, Schumer is already calling for an overthrow of Netanyahu, and Biden is scolding Israel over a tragic incident that did, in fact, lead to innocent lives being lost, but it does happen at war. However, it should never be our job to tell Israel or any other country what to do. Let the people who represent them decide how and when and what they want to do there. We have a long history of this, and it hasn't gone well, almost ever. Let's take a little trip down memory lane. The Bay of Pigs, 1961. The U.S. tries to carry out a small invasion of Cuba aimed at taking out communism. Fidel Castro doesn't go as planned at all, actually. The U.S. fails. Total embarrassment. Castro goes on to rule Cuba until his death in 2016. Communism still reigns. Staying in the Cold War, though, we funded and armed a proxy fighting force in Afghanistan, a little group you might have heard of called the Taliban. We gave them munitions. We gave them training, other resources with no accountability whatsoever. Fast forward to the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, October 2001, where we then tried to take out the Taliban and the government, which was harboring al-Qaeda, led by Osama bin Laden, who also was previously a U.S. government asset. Not too dissimilar, though, to the Iraq War after 9/11. In 1983, Donald Rumsfeld, and seen in that picture right there, and Saddam Hussein recorded a historic handshake orchestrated by Ronald Reagan. We supported Saddam Hussein and his rise to power in Iraq in an effort to stifle Iran's influence in the region. How'd that work out? We ended up overthrowing him, too, with absolutely no plan, and the entire country's infrastructure went to hell in a handbasket. Then we left, and Lloyd Austin, who was the commanding general in Iraq at the time, his withdrawal gave birth to ISIS. Chalk another L up for U.S. foreign policy intervention. I should know. I spent 9 years in and out of that country. Oh, and by the way, we're not even going to get into Vietnam. So who are we to think that we can call for a change in leadership in Israel? Why do we think that we should get to dictate how Israel carries out its elections or its campaigns against terrorists in their own backyard? We have no right to think that. We certainly don't have the track record to back it up. Let's bring in Army Lieutenant Colonel Tony Shaffer and human rights attorney and founder of End Jew Hatred Movement, Brooke Goldstein. Tony, I mean, look, I love the U.S. of A., and I think we do great things sometimes, but maybe sit this one out.
So John Kirby's comments on this today were horrific. I don't know if you caught the press conference, but the way he outlined this, it was juvenile. One of the things he said, Carl, is that we're trying to hold them to a higher standard, but he wouldn't define that standard. And at the same time he's saying that, he's trying his best to essentially pander to the left here in the country by saying, yeah, we're supporting the Israelis, but not as much as you think we are. The bottom line is this: we need to give them what they need to complete their task of defeating Hamas.
But they're doing fine. They don't even need us.
That's true, too. Yeah. And the thing is, the best thing we could do, Carl, stay out of their way. Let them get their job done.
That's where I'm at. But Brooke, you know, why does Joe Biden, Chuck Schumer, and all these other Democrats, why do they get to scold Israel? Like, they were like, we need to have a strategic ceasefire. They had a ceasefire until a bunch of nut jobs parachuted in and shot up a music festival of innocent Israelis.
That's right. And I'm glad you pointed out that it was Hamas that started this war. It is Hamas that broke the ceasefire. And while all of the civilian deaths during this conflict are a tragedy, the Israeli civilian deaths, the American civilian deaths, the Canadian civilian deaths, the Palestinian civilian deaths, the question is, who bears responsibility? And under an objective, fair reading of the laws of armed conflict and international law, it is Hamas, a designated terrorist group who has embedded itself within the civilian population, who is starving the civilian population, who, if it stopped the conflict tomorrow, there would be no more civilian casualties, which is primarily responsible for the death.
And Brooke, like everybody knows, I think anybody rational person, except for the weirdos marching around on the street out in front of my office in Manhattan, everybody knows that this was Hamas who kind of did this stuff. But, you know, Tony, we're beyond the blame game at this point. Now, like we were saying, Rafah, okay, Biden wants Israel to stay out, but Israel's like, hey, look, we've been trying to live with this for, 30, 40 years, and every single time it ends with us getting attacked, you know, by random happenstance. Whenever Hamas gets the resources, the goods, and the ability to do so, we got to finish this. And, you know, America's trying to talk them out of it.
Yeah, and then the solution, Carl, is to put in the Palestinian Authority, who also teaches river to the sea doctrine to their kids. No, the Biden administration is trying to do everything it can to attenuate our support or their need to win by the fact that you have radical elements of the Democrat Party who are now opposing Joe Biden. That's all this is. It's all propaganda based on what Biden and the party thinks. And again, we all agree, let the Israelis go do their job to win, and then they should stay there as long as they need to. The Palestinian Authority is not the answer to replace Hamas.
Yeah, I mean, Brooke, could you imagine if, I don't know, Israel was telling us that we need to keep letting Chinese nationals in at our southern border?
Yeah, creating another Islamist terror state in a sea of failed Islamic dictatorships is not a solution to anything. And people need to understand Rafah must be entered into and Hamas must be taken out of Rafah. Rafah is the point, the location where all of the arms, all of the weapons are smuggled in from Egypt. So there can be no end to civilian casualties, and there'll be more civilian casualties if Hamas is allowed to continue to carry out its terrorist attack.
Meanwhile, Biden's wants to remove the Houthis from the Houthi rebels, the pirates, from the terrorist watch list. Unbelievable. Lieutenant Colonel Tony Schaefer, Brooke Goldstein, appreciate it.
Thanks, Carl.
Coming up, Biden's wide open border causing